there, my name is Dorothy Maffei, and I joined the Peterborough Players in 1977. It was in the middle of the season, actually towards the end, and Peter Dowling, the then stage manager, got a Broadway or off-Broadway show, I don't remember which, and they needed a stage manager right away. I had worked with Chuck at the Folger Theater Group in Washington. He was an actor, I was an assistant stage manager, and also during that season I worked with Paul Schneider, who was a director that Chuck had gone to Columbia with. So I'd heard a lot about the Peterborough Players, and I'd hoped someday to actually be able to work there. So it was midweek, the phone rang, I was painting my apartment, not working, in 87-degree weather. And when Chuck said, "Can you pack and get up here by Sunday to Tech Fantastics?" I didn't even blink before I said yes. And that started my wonderful relationship with the Peterborough Players. I actually can't imagine what my life would have been without this. Over the years, not only was I a stage manager from 1977 to 1981, but I was able to be on the search committees when we hired Gus and when we hired Keith, to stage manage a benefit of Love Letters with Jim Whitmore and Audra Lindley, which was a very special experience. I was honored to stage manage Robeson with Avery Brooks, that was produced by Ellen, both in Peterborough and in Boston. And most recently, a couple of years ago, I did a winter show, stage managed, Chuck directed, of JACOB Marley's Christmas Carol, and I got to work with Craig and Tom and Bridget. And that takes me up to now. It's been a joy. I've been asked to read from Our Playhouse, a history of the first 75 years of the Players, written by Allen Sherman. And this chapter is called Renaissance and Goodbye. Despite financial challenges, the Players had strong momentum leading them into this season. Sally and artistic director Chuck Morey had hired a large professional company. There were 18 equity contracts, compared to as few as 9 in the 1976 season. The veterans included Richmond Hoxie, Richard Matthews, John Gracio, Richard Fancy, Bob Alvin, and Rosanna Cox, and joining them were newcomers Paul Austin, Joe Costa, Barbara Etta Young, Tom McDermott, Hal Scott, George Taylor, Kathleen Toland, and Janet Zarish. Sally persuaded Ellen Dinerstein to rejoin the Players staff as promotion manager, a position that by the end of the summer had evolved into responsibilities equivalent to general manager. Beginning in 1975, after Sally's surgery, and continuing until 1982, Ellen, who had spent time in New York and Los Angeles and completed an MBA at UNH's Whitmore School, always returned home to the farm. She said, "This is literally where I brought my dirty laundry. For all those years, I did not take a job, make a move, or any important decision without the counsel's support and sometimes a kick in the pants from Sally and Bob." While I didn't work in an official capacity at the theater again until 1980, following my apprenticeship in 1973, throughout the remainder of the decade, I spent time at the theater helping Sally with correspondence, apprentice interviews, and a variety of other tasks. These were all accomplished within the hazy boundaries between family, friendship, and theater that defined many Players' relationships with Stearns Farm and the Brown family, largely unclear and equally unimportant. I have often teased Beth about my extra duties at the theater of helping to load and unload her belongings back and forth from school and other adventures, along with painting equity houses, cleaning cabins, and so much more. But that season I was both stage manager and a director. Lulu returned in the role of associate technical director. Amy Levine was brought in for me as stage manager so I could direct. And the Players kicked off their season with Anthony Sheffer's mystery thriller, Sleuth. George Taylor and John Gracio were hysterical, playing the lead roles, and their performances were enjoyed by mostly full houses. During one performance, George Taylor lost his place and shot John Gracio about 10 pages too early. Chuck remembers it being one of the best ad-lib exchanges he had ever heard. John said, "I guess you missed," and almost simultaneously George said, "Ha ha, they were blanks." After a stunned moment or two, they both continued as if nothing at all had happened. This was my first opportunity to direct on the main stage. I had directed some apprentice shows in previous summers, and it was Garson Kanan's Born Yesterday. The pressure was on, so all sorts of things went awry. I had arranged for costumes to be borrowed for the character of Billy, and they mysteriously never arrived. I had wanted to use them because they magnificently set off her transition from being kind of a doll to being a real live human person. But I don't know what happened to them. Hal Scott, who was playing Devery, got sick and missed opening night. Chuck saved the day with book in hand so the show could go on. And I borrowed a sofa, which I had promised Sally would not be damaged, which went down like the Titanic in the last scene of the play. It was fixed, but oh, show business. Finale of the season was a new play honoring their commitment that they made back in 1977, and it was Percy Grainger's Unheard Songs. It was easily the most popular new play produced by the Players over the last 4 seasons. Its near-capacity audiences rivaled those of Born Yesterday and other established plays in the season. And 2 years later, it appeared off-Broadway under Morey's direction. The popular success and increased ticket demand over the last 3 seasons and the need for additional revenue to help offset higher annual budgets had some of the Players' staff and advisors seriously considering a project to expand the seating capacity of the theater. The notion had been discussed in the past, but never got off the ground. But now, the people working with Sally, the staff, her advisors, believed it was not only feasible, but necessary. Joe Ziegler, then on the advisory board of the Players, recalled in a later interview, "In June of '80, I went to see Sally and said, 'You're in trouble and you don't even know it. Here you are with a 150-seat theater playing at 95% capacity, and you're in trouble. You can't grow.'" Ziegler proposed holding a retreat to deliberate and plan for the future. Sally's now legendary reply was, "I refuse to be involved in anything called a retreat. Let's call it an advance." And in the autumn of 1980, Sally and her board scheduled a 2-day slate of meetings in the neighboring town of Temple. The first task discussed was a new board of trustees that would have jurisdiction over finances and operation of the theater. Cecil Lyon made an extremely eloquent statement to Sally, the gist of which was that it was time to let her family's baby be taken care of by the greater community, and that the one thing they wanted, above all, is to perpetuate the Peterborough Players. Here's part of what Cecil said. "The Peterborough Players feel a great need in this community, and they must, I repeat must, continue. Now we know you have a rather large family. I believe the next generation is 7. What we're wondering is how we can somehow, with their consent and yours, continue to operate the Peterborough Players where it is. That would mean transferring the barn and the surrounding buildings and a bit of land to some corporation with the understanding that it would eventually revert to the family if and when, God forbid, the Players ceased to exist. The decision to move forward on this would be up to the Brown family and the incorporators, and that decision was accomplished in March of 1981. Appointed as lifetime trustees to the new board were former incorporators Sally Stearns Brown, Isabel Gay Stearns, Johnny Stearns, Richard Noyes, and Henry Franklin. Appointed to the board were Paul Cummings, Mrs. Frederick Ernst, Priscilla Herland, John Lord, Dick Monahan, Cecil Lyon, Ellen Malsby, Robert Orchard, Russell Smith, Robert Brandon, Mrs. Frances DeMarneff, Dr. Theodore Renna, and Clinton Yeomans. Russell Smith, chairman of the former advisory board and dear and longtime friend to Sally, explained to the press that the structural change to a board of trustees was for the purpose of making the Players permanent. It was the beginning of separating operations from the family. Sally had always worried about asking for financial support of things that were owned by her family. As Joe Ziegler put it, you can't raise money to fix up Sally's barn. For Sally, the process of separating without distancing the theater from herself and the family was unfolding. I remember this, and I remember it took her time to find her way through these challenges. Chuck said about this time, she wasn't resisting, but she was slow and deliberate in her thinking and in her decision-making process. She didn't want to do anything that first and foremost would negatively affect her family, and then the extended family that was the Peterborough Players. Sometimes the needs of those two families did not exactly align. Ellen, reflecting on conversations with Sally that year, said, "Sally was very appreciative of what the group had accomplished through the advance, but beyond the prospective capital improvements to the building, she didn't have a clear vision or path in mind for how the fundamental structure of the theater would evolve. She still felt very much alone in the year-round responsibilities of managing the theater, and while tired and overworked, was frankly afraid to let go of the leadership reins." In 1981, the nation's economy was still experiencing inflation, and the Players' budget was growing. The Reagan administration was proposing to cut the National Endowment for the Arts budget in half. Similar notions of reducing funding for the New Hampshire Commission on the Arts were heard from the Capitol. Sally listed all of these factors in an open letter she wrote to the Transcript, urging public support of not only her theater, but all cultural organizations which rely on donations. In spite of this economic environment, a large company was recruited to Stearns Farm in 1981. In reading the season's reviews, the most striking observation is how well the actors performed. More than not, the critics were left struggling to single out a specific actor for the highest praise. "It turned out to be our all-star season," said Chuck, though we didn't know it at the time. In the company that summer were Dana Ivey, who has earned multiple Tony nominations over the years, Pat Richardson, who was to go on and star in the TV hit Home Improvement, David Rasche, who went on to star in his own TV series Sledgehammer, as well as Jim Rebhorn, who had become a very highly respected film and Broadway actor. But while many people were involved in the resurgence at Stearns Farm, it was Maury's wisdom and foresight that led the way. During his tenure from 1969 to 1988, the last 5 of those years being artistic director, he impressed his artistic philosophy on the Players' season. The inclusion of classical plays on a consistent basis, a more balanced and diverse repertoire, innovative adaptations of settings and casting, varied staging of productions, and a commitment to hosting new plays and playwrights were all hallmarks of his vision for the theater. The fact that Sally shared Chuck's vision and trusted his judgment made for a very effective management team. "Sally was, in every sense of the word, my mentor, surrogate mother, guide, and dear, dear friend," said Chuck. "She gave me opportunities I really had no business undertaking at the time. She had faith in me. And it was around her dining room table that I learned everything I ever knew of any importance about the theater and about life." Aside from attending a performance, by 1981, all a person had to do to realize the miraculous turnaround that had been executed over the last few years at the Peterborough Players was to stroll by the barn. Any summer evening when the lights were up, one would see the overcrowded parking lot, marvel at the long line of people waiting to buy tickets, and watch as the standing room only sign was hung up again and again. The 1982 season. During the winter before the 1980 season, I remember going to the farm quite a bit to help Sally with details of the expansion, to just support her. I was working full-time at Hartford Stage, and I was able to be much closer and to visit much more often, which I really enjoyed. Players' audience were welcome to a newly renovated building when the curtain went up on opening night. Enough money had been raised during the winter months that they implemented the first round of capital improvements, which started with an expansion of house seating capacity, scheduled to be ready in time for the opening of the season. The new extension to the house end of the barn was erected, adding 54 new seats. This raised the total seating to 207. Local architect and sometimes player actor Rick Monahan designed the plans for the project. Dave Stevenson milled and assembled the timber frame, and Ned Eldridge executed the construction. One of the most visible and much needed technical improvements was the construction of a turntable that allowed pre-assembled sets to be rotated in and out of the main performing area in a more expeditious and less obtrusive manner. The audience for the Players' openings production of the season, Betrayal, raised a spontaneous cheer as the stage set smoothly and quietly appeared. No longer technicians and assistants scrambling on stage to make the appropriate changes to props and sets. Scene changes in full view of the house. Technical director Nick Miller was largely responsible for designing and welding together this new stage turntable. It was one of the many innovative ideas that represented his constant efforts to challenge and expand the technical capacities of the theater. The Players followed up with what turned out to be an extremely popular production, Scapino. Written by Frank Dunlap and Jim Dale, it was a revival of Molière's 1671 comedy with added slapstick and burlesque and songs. Alice Fold, writing for The Sentinel, described Jim Janssen's Scapino as just stupendous. Lean and limber, he is a charming rogue of boundless energy. The almost indescribable whole was played at breakneck, breathless speed by the cast, some of whom careened across audience laps in the course of the evening. All of it took place on a wonderfully recreated Italian town square designed by Chris Novak, who had earned quite a reputation for the high quality of his stagecraft over the past few seasons. Chris was back for the first time since 1976 when he had designed the entire season, said Maury. It was a mark of growth that we could now bring in designers for a single show rather than one designer who did everything for an entire season. The highlight of the Players' off-season was Sally receiving the Peterborough Chamber of Commerce Award for Citizen of the Year. It was a grand night for a wonderful lady. Sally's husband Bob was probably the one person who knew how difficult it was for her to attend the ceremony. Bob would later recall, because she was a friendly person and was interested in and liked everyone she met, few people realized what a shy and very private person she was. According to Bob, Sally claimed that her graduate studies in theatrical lighting at Yale were started as insurance against having to stand under the stage lights herself. And like her mother, EBS, she had strong personal feelings about avoiding the limelight, preferring instead to deflect it onto her staff, company, and all the volunteers and friends who helped support the theater. Bob would later write that only by holding the thought that she was representing the people whose collective efforts over the years made the Peterborough Players possible was she able to bring herself to attend the banquet given in her honor. Likewise, few people realized how important Bob was to Sally when it came to her emotional support and with dealing with the demands and challenges of running the theater. Bob was never listed on the theater staff as an employee, but he frequently helped out, along with being the self-described house husband of Sally. Bob also claimed that his chief role at the theater was to pour scotch on bruised egos of company members. But as Richard Cox noted, his role was much more than that. He became a valuable contributor to the amazing salon of artists and interesting characters from all walks of life who talked around that wonderful table in that little red house when the curtain came down. And the discussions were richer for having Bob around. Bob Brown was not an easy man to appreciate based on first impressions. His personality and conversational style were too abrasive and forthright for some people. Despite his somewhat harsh outward demeanor, he had a heart of gold and a great generosity for friends, family, and longtime players who knew him best. And Sally adored him. Chamber President Leach made the presentation and gave a short speech. As board president Phil Running recalled, that award was a recognition of the feelings everyone had toward her, both personally and as director of the Peterborough Players. The Players were hard at work planning the upcoming 50th anniversary season when Sally became ill after receiving the Citizen of the Year award. Her condition was grave. She was taken to Manchester for diagnostic procedures and then to Concord Hospital. Colin, Craig, Chuck Morey, Ellen Dinerstein, Dorothy Maffei joined Bob, Drusilla, Lulu, and Beth for the weeks-long vigil at Sally's bedside. After consulting with specialists, she was transferred to Mass General with the intent of stabilizing her condition. I remember we were waiting to hear, but this was not to be, and she died, succumbing to complications resulting from a brain aneurysm. She was 68 years old. The shocking grief of Sally's death was felt by everyone associated with Players. just as it had been when her mother died in 1961. And like the reaction to EBS's passing, everyone who knew Sally tempered the grief with an equally strong feeling of gratitude for having had the opportunity to know her. Bob Brown wrote a touching goodbye to Sally that was published in February 17th edition of the Peterborough transcript. Sally Stearns Brown died Tuesday afternoon the way she lived, quietly and placing as light a burden on others as possible. She spared us the lingering death many families have to suffer. She slipped away over a period of 3 weeks, giving us a chance to say goodbye in our hearts and to start the healing process of grief gradually. Few people who had ever spent 5 minutes with her called her Mrs. Brown. Except in the formality of diplomatic or military protocol, she was Sally to children, associates, theater people, and to much of her beloved Monadnock region. To the soldiers and airmen to whom she served coffee and donuts in Sicily, Italy, and Germany from 1943 to 46, she was quite simply Sally, as she was to the 8 men on the victorious 1936 Rawlins crew, of which she was coxswain. A perfectionist in setting standards, she learned to accept the shortcomings of everybody except herself. Laughing at her faith in mankind, she claimed she was an adult before she learned that, contrary to what she had been led to believe in childhood. Not everybody tells the truth all the time. None of us could possibly be all she hoped we would be. Continuing to love the sinner while hating the sin, she usually kept us from knowing that she knew of our failures. She succeeded in concealing her disappointment in us. A Peterborough player who had the run of her home once commented, "She's got to be some kind of saint." She was so very good at listening and so very good at giving wise advice. She would have liked a neat, orderly house and spent a lot of time trying to keep things picked up after us. But she cheerfully accepted the disorder and disrepairs which having so many people around so much of the time imposed. A modest lack of awareness of her low-keyed charisma, which so often inspired others to try to make themselves useful, led to her telling a newspaper interviewer that she was a doer, not a leader. Her approach was to look around for what wasn't being done and pitch in to do it. An approach which sometimes led to her scrubbing the toilet minutes before the audience arrived, and which almost nightly had her picking up cigarette butts missed by the apprentices assigned to drape the area. There's a symbolic appropriateness that Edith von Stearns was born on February 14th, because in such matters as their love of people and their concern for everyone with whom they came in contact, the two women lived what can be seen as one continuing productive life stretching 99 years and a day. Together they left an organizational legacy whose immediate memorial will be the coming 50th anniversary season. Most importantly, they helped hundreds of us to be more than we would have otherwise have been. For me, the loss of Sally was very hard. It hit me hard like it did so many others. She had steadied me and supported me through most of my 20s and early 30s. She was my friend, mother, confidant, and mentor. Her death left a very big hole in my life. A memorial service was held at Peterborough's All Saints Episcopal Church on February 21st. Chuck Morey delivered the eulogy, invoking the stage manager's climactic speech from the third act of Our Town, the one that speaks of the difference between that which is temporary in our lives and that which is eternal. A separate interment service was held the following spring when Sally's ashes were laid to rest along with EBS and Jimmy Welsh in Pine Hill Cemetery. Unlike the uncertainty surrounding the theater's future after EBS's death in 1961, when closing the doors was almost a foregone conclusion by many players, there was reason for more optimism after Sally's death. The upcoming 1983 anniversary season was not in question, had been planned for over a year, and the theater staff and company were being assembled. However, despite these accomplishments, there were many issues with the theater that needed to be addressed in the coming years. It still remained difficult to determine where the Brown family ended and the theater began. Perhaps just as importantly, there was no member of the family who was experienced enough and willing to assume the theater's leadership, as had been the case with Sally when her mother died. As much as some individuals saw hope for the theater's future when reflecting on the positive accomplishments of recent years, it's not surprising that there were also those who believed the theater might have to close after the 1983 season. Although members of the fall advance in 1981 had resolved that decision-making processes and more formal agreements needed to be established, there were no specific plans that had been discussed and agreed upon between the family and the theater at the time of Sally's death. The issues surrounding the future leadership and the direction of the theater would be relegated to the back burner for the remainder of this season. The Players had a season to produce. Chuck Morey, Ellen Dinerstoon, Lulu Brown, and Colin Craig collectively assumed responsibility for operating the theater during the 1983 season. All of them resumed the hard work that was required every winter and spring to produce the summer season. Ellen led the additional task of planning and coordinating the celebration, an enormous job in itself. Local volunteers and longtime players contributed significant time helping with this effort. People such as Betty Morrison, Kathy Runyon, Priscilla Herlin, Bobby DeMarniff, and a host of others. Sally's daughter Beth quit her job and returned to Peterborough to help with the season and the events. And there were many other players and friends of the Brown Stearns family who were not on the payroll, but came to lend a hand. I myself I ran cleanup that season, I think, and I came up often, staying with Ellen and spending a day usually running a list of errands ranging from buying or turkeys or carving turkeys to photocopying town to whatever was needed. Sally's absence lingered as an unspoken pall over the theater that spring and summer. I find myself wanting to go in the house to see her. Then I remember, said Rosanna Cox that season. But everyone understood that the best way to honor her memory was to make it one of the best seasons ever. On April 14th, 1983, Governor John Sununu declared the summer to be the Summer of the Peterborough Players by official proclamation. And he was one of the several dignitaries who attended the June 18th performance of Our Town to inaugurate the Players' 50th anniversary season. Congressman Judd Gregg and Senator Gordon Humphrey were also present. National Endowment for the Arts Chair Frank Hotzel brought greetings and a congratulatory letter from President Ronald Reagan to commemorate the event. Telegrams and letters from alumni and friends living around the country overflowed P.O. Box 1 in Peterborough, the Players and the Browns mailing address. The curtain for the Saturday's show was moved to 7 o'clock, honoring the exact date and time of the first production in the barn, 50 years before. Following this show, there was a champagne and dinner and a lovely tent in the South Meadow in the property behind the barn and the farmhouse with live music and lots of dancing. Players alumni from all over the country had called to see if they could drop by for the occasion. After the curtain calls, the ceremonies began with Board President Phil Runyon presiding, introducing honored guests, introducing Players alumni back for the celebration, and government emissaries. Then he gave way to Johnny Stearns, Sally's brother, now a successful television producer on the West Coast. It was a wonderfully entertaining speech, and towards the end, Johnny naturally spoke of the future. EBS ran this theater for 30 years. That was Act 1. Sally ran it for another 20 years, and that was Act 2. Now we have Chuck and Ellen and Lulu and all these other fun people, and with your help, Act 3 is just beginning tonight. Bob followed Johnny on stage and said a few words about Sally and how happy she would have been to witness this event. And then he turned the stage over to Chuck Morey. A few guests noticed him later, wandering around outside the barn, occasionally peering in, his eyes bright with tears. Chuck told the audience of the decision to present an annual Peterborough Players Alumni Award and how the choice of the first recipient had been obvious, Rosanna Cox. There was a great ovation as Rosie came on stage. Still in costume from her performance as Julia Gibbs, she accepted the award, thanked Chuck, and gave a tribute to the Stearns and Brown families for taking her in with them as they took in so many others. This is written in the book. Beth and I sat at the back of the theater crying furiously, but we all were, said Chuck. It was an incredibly emotional moment for all of us. At the first rehearsal of Our Town, many of us spontaneously burst into tears before the read-through even began, said Chuck. The entire production, the entire summer, was part of Sally's celebration of life and accomplishment. Part summer, long wake, part theater season. After all the pomp and ceremony, the crowd of almost 220 people made its way to the brightly lit tent in the meadow for dinner, drinks, and dancing. What was the secret of the Peterborough Players' success? First, it was the product of dedication, perseverance, and hard work by the two women, mother and daughter, who founded and ran the theater for half a century. Then there were all the staff, technicians, directors, and actors who strove to produce their very best over the years, along with the devotion of countless friends, sponsors, contributors, and volunteers. But it was very simple, Chuck pointed out. No occupancy costs, such as rent or mortgage, and we were all working for peanuts. But aside from EBS and later Sally, who owned the theater, what compelled the other people to give so willingly of their time, to contribute and support financially, to promote and sustain, to make the trek down the tree-lined road to the humble barn, to produce and act in plays, many of them summer after summer, year after year. I just remember my heart used to soar when I went down the driveway because it was always a place of safety and joy for me. I always looked forward to catching up with Sally and being able to share my challenges and my triumphs, and she was always interested in them. Whether it was pre-season when I was working, or when I was working on the staff, or on holidays when I just became part of the family, or during a winter visit when Colin and Sally and I would eat our dinner watching TV and spend the whole evening loudly pronouncing every actor that we saw. Oh, he's a Peterborough player. She's a Peterborough player. Hence the saying that once a Peterborough player, always a Peterborough player. But what had nurtured this theater for 5 decades and what was celebrated that evening might be called the soul of the Peterborough Players, born of the love that EBS and Sally gave to the theater and to everyone who came into their lives. When reading all the letters sent to EBS and Sally over the years from individuals reflecting on their experiences at Stern Farms, from apprentices to patrons, nearly all of them, over and over again, speak of the warmth, the love, the feeling of belonging, and especially of feeling like family. Tim Clark remembers one backstage moment during the run of Our Town that captures a small part of the soul of the Peterborough Players. I was out behind the dressing rooms during the break between Acts 1 and 2, talking to an apprentice, when she suddenly said, "Look at the moon." I turned around and there it was, huge and salmon-colored, resting on the eastern horizon like a soap bubble. "I'm going to get everyone," she said, and rushed back into the dressing rooms. Actors started spilling out the doors like clowns out of a circus car. They seemed to give a collective sigh of wonder. Then someone started singing softly, "By the light of the silvery moon." Everyone joined in, swaying in the moonlight. The stage manager, Becky Lynn, came out to call places. "Places," she barked. "All business. Places for Act 2. Places, please." "Look at that moon." And she scrambled up on a rock for a better view. A second wave of actors and tech people burst out of the door, and Becky was torn between rapture and duty. "Places," she said urgently. "Please, everyone. Dennis, have you seen the moon? Go look at it quickly, but come right back." Places for Act 2. In Act 3 of Our Town, Emily Webb plaintively asked the stage manager after her death, "Do any human beings ever realize life while they live it? Every minute?" "No. Saints and poets, maybe. They do, some," is his reply. EBS and Sally would have disagreed. Anyone with a heartbeat and a vestige of a soul who saw the play and heard the speakers on that enchanted summer evening probably would have disagreed as well.